What would you do if one day, the laughter in your home faded, and all that was left was silence? Have you ever truly stopped to think about what it means to grow old, not just in age, but in spirit, in solitude, and in the quiet spaces where once there was life? Aging isn't simply a passage of time, it's the unfolding of reality. A reality many are unprepared for until it's already here. This video isn't just about growing older. It's about what happens when you suddenly find yourself sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a chair across from you that used to be filled. It's about the shift, the heartbreaking, disorienting shift, when the people you gave your life to begin living their own, and you're left wondering what's next. What now? You're about to meet David, a 74-year-old man whose story speaks for millions. He didn't expect his later years to feel like this, hollow, too quiet, and at times, unbearably lonely. He did everything right, raised his children, cared for his wife until her final breath, worked hard, saved money. And still, when the house fell silent, when the visits became less frequent, when the phone stopped ringing, he realized he wasn't ready. David's journey is a reflection of what many won't admit, that aging can be isolating. That grief doesn't just come from losing someone, but from watching life continue without you at its center. But here's the truth that gives this story its power. David didn't surrender to that silence. He began to listen, not to the absence, but to what that emptiness was trying to teach him. Through heartbreak, through loneliness, through days that felt painfully long, he discovered something many miss, the strength that lies in rebuilding, even when everything feels broken. And it wasn't easy. After his wife passed, and his children became absorbed in their busy lives, David tried to keep going. But inside, the walls were closing in. Until one moment changed everything, a conversation with a friend that hit harder than he expected. What if you end up alone completely? That haunting question wouldn't let go. It forced him to confront the reality most people avoid. It's here, at this emotional turning point, that I want to ask you something. Have you felt this too? The quiet moments that used to feel peaceful now sting with emptiness. The calls that don't come. The footsteps that no longer echo in the hallway. If any part of David's story already feels familiar, you're not alone. And if it resonates, do something now. Comment 1 below if you've ever felt the weight of solitude. Comment 0 if you haven't, but want to better understand those who do. Like this video so more people can hear this message. And subscribe, because we're building something here, a space of understanding, reflection, and support for everyone navigating this stage of life. In the chapters ahead, David learns how to live again. Not through grand gestures, not through some magical rescue, but through small, deeply human choices. He finds connection not in the crowded places, but in the quiet ones. In parks, in chance encounters, in people who've also been left behind by time. He meets Margaret, a woman whose story mirrors his own. And together, without trying to replace what was lost, they create something new, companionship built not on need, but on understanding. Their bond proves something few talk about openly, that love, support, and connection don't stop in youth. They can bloom again in later life, in quieter, more meaningful ways. But nothing in this life stays the same. And when David faces loss again, it hits harder than before. Yet this time, he's stronger. Because through it all, grief, change, aging, he's learned how to keep going, how to hold on to the people who matter, and how to let go when that's what love requires. So stay with me. This isn't just David's story, it's a map, a guide for how to keep living when life shifts beneath your feet. A reminder that even in the loneliest chapters, there is still beauty to be found. Let's begin. 1. David's story begins. He had always pictured retirement as a quiet reward for a life well lived, a time for rest, reflection, and simple pleasures. And in some ways, it was. David, now 74, had worked hard for decades as an electrician in upstate New York. He'd saved carefully, spent wisely, and made sure his family never had to go without. When the time came to hang up his tool belt, he felt ready. He had earned this next chapter. But life, as it often does, didn't stick to the script. His retirement didn't begin with celebration or peace. It began with loss. Just 2 years after stepping away from work, David lost his wife, Linda, to a long illness. They had been married for over 40 years. She had been his partner, his anchor, his best friend. Losing her felt like losing half of himself. The house they had shared, once filled with the sound of laughter, Sunday music, and shared meals, became still. Too still. The children, Michael and Sarah, were grown with families of their own. They called when they could, visited when their schedules allowed. But the truth was, their lives had moved on. As they should have. David would never begrudge them that. He had raised them to be strong, independent, and self-sufficient. And they were all of those things. But that didn't soften the ache of absence. The subtle shift from being needed every day to being remembered once in a while. He remembered the day it hit him. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special. He had gone out early to pick up groceries, stopped for coffee, and returned to an empty house. As he carried the bags inside, he paused. No one to say welcome back. No one to ask how his morning had gone. Just the ticking of the kitchen clock and the creak of the floorboards under his feet. He sat down in the living room, the same spot where he and Linda used to drink tea and watch the news. Her chair was still there, her reading glasses untouched on the side table. The silence around him was loud in its own way. He stared out the window, his thoughts scattered like fallen leaves across the years. There was a time when the house was alive, kids racing through the halls, birthday candles being blown out, the aroma of Thanksgiving dinner filling every corner. But those moments felt like another life now, one he could remember vividly, but couldn't touch. The hardest part, he realized, wasn't aging. It was the slow fading of relevance. You don't stop maturing all at once. It happens quietly, gradually. One less phone call, one missed invitation. Until one day you wake up and realize the world no longer asks for you. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't feel anger. Just a dull ache. A slow, hollowing out feeling that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the day. But David wasn't ready to surrender to it. Not yet. I didn't come this far just to sit in silence, he muttered to himself one evening, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. His eyes had changed, more tired. Yes, but still sharp. Still full of life. There had to be more waiting for him, even if he didn't know what that was yet. He began journaling late at night, putting thoughts on paper that he couldn't speak out loud. He wrote about Linda, about the past, and about the strange emptiness that had taken hold of his days. Writing became a way to process the pain, a form of survival. One morning, while flipping through old photo albums, David paused at a picture of him and Linda in the garden. She was laughing, holding a flower pot, her eyes full of joy. He smiled. That image reminded him of something. Joy isn't gone. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. He made himself a small promise. He would start walking again. Just a few blocks at first. Maybe stop by the park. Maybe strike up a conversation with a neighbor. Small things, but meaningful. It wasn't about filling time. It was about reclaiming it. David didn't know it yet, but that simple act, stepping outside, choosing motion over stillness, was the first step towards something bigger. Toward healing. Toward connection. Toward remembering that he wasn't invisible and his story wasn't over. Because while grief is heavy, it's not immovable. And while silence may settle in, it doesn't have to stay forever. 2. The weight of silence. It's strange how silence can be louder than any sound you've ever heard. The morning began like most others. David, now 74, rose early. He made his bed the way Linda used to, tight corners, a neat fold at the top. He boiled water for tea, letting the steam rise like memory into the still kitchen air. The sunlight peeked through the blinds, casting soft lines across the table where he sat alone. No calls. No visits planned. No obligations. Just time. Too much of it. There was a time when David longed for quiet, a break from the demands of work, the rush of raising children, the endless list of things to do. But now, the silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like absence. Like something was missing. Or someone. He poured his tea and sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him. That chair used to belong to Linda. She'd read the newspaper there every morning, humming under her breath as she flipped the pages. Now, the chair sat still. The newspaper no longer came. The house, once a haven of life, had become a museum of memories. That morning, David realized something that rattled him to the core. Silence had stopped being background noise. It had become a presence of its own. It followed him from room to room, watching, waiting. It clung to the air, settling into the spaces where laughter used to live. He stood and wandered the house, slowly. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. He passed the family portraits, Michael's graduation photo, Sarah holding her firstborn, and a wedding picture of him and Linda, both of them young and full of plans. Now, those plans had run their course, and all that remained was the echo of everything that once was. The phone sat quietly on the counter. He checked it anyway. No messages. He wasn't angry at his children. He understood. Really, he did. They had lives to live, careers, spouses, kids of their own. But understanding didn't protect him from the ache of being forgotten. There's a difference between knowing something and being okay with it. He tried to fill the space. He'd turn the radio on, letting the old jazz station hum in the background. Sometimes he left the TV playing, even if he wasn't watching. But the noise didn't touch the kind of silence he felt. That silence lived deeper, in the heart, not in the ears. Later that day, his neighbor John stopped by. The two had known each other for years, sharing little chats at the mailbox or nods from their driveways. But today was different. John lingered, sensing something in the air. "It's just you here now, huh?" he said, his voice low as they sat on the porch. David nodded. "Most days, yeah." John took a breath. "Same over at my place. Wife's always busy with her charity work. The kids are scattered all over. I go days without hearing from them." There was a quiet pause between them. And then John said something David wouldn't forget. "You ever wonder what it's going to be like when we're really alone? I mean, no one checking in, no one dropping by." David didn't answer right away, but his stomach tightened at the thought. It was the kind of question you usually avoid, the kind you bury beneath distractions. But once it's asked, it lingers. That night, as David lay in bed, those words came back, pressing on his chest like a weight. What if one day I'm all alone? Really alone? What then? He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He had his health for now. He had his mind for now. But time has its own plans. What would happen if he slipped in the shower? If he got sick in the middle of the night? Would anyone know? The silence was no longer just emotional. It was practical. It was dangerous. That fear didn't come with panic. It came with a dull, heavy certainty, one that older adults often face, but rarely say out loud. The truth is, loneliness can be more harmful than illness. It creeps in slowly, then takes root. And if you let it, it convinces you that you're invisible. But David wasn't ready to let that happen. Not yet. He sat up in bed and whispered to himself. Something has to change. His voice cracked with emotion, but there was strength behind it. This couldn't be his life, not like this. Not just waiting for the phone to ring. Not just existing in a house that had turned into a shell. If he was going to live these later years with any kind of dignity, he'd have to make the first move. Not to chase after his children or beg for attention, but to start building a life around himself. To reconnect, somehow, with the world. One quiet afternoon, David sat in his usual spot, near the window, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. The house around him stood still, every corner echoing the absence of what once was. The laughter, the hurried footsteps, the voices, it had all faded. That's when his neighbor John stopped by. Same age, same story, both retired, both alone more than they'd like to admit. They exchanged the usual greetings, but something felt heavier that day. John's eyes drifted around the quiet room, then settled on David. With a sigh, he said softly, "So it's just you now, huh?" David nodded, trying to keep the emotion buried beneath a polite smile. But then John asked something that would stick with him for weeks. "What if one day you're really all alone? No visits, no calls, no one to check on you. What would you do then?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. David didn't know what to say, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence that followed was louder than any answer could have been. After John left, the question kept playing on a loop in David's mind. It followed him into the kitchen, into the hallway, into bed. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, the thought sitting on his chest like a weight. What would I do? There was a time when David never feared being alone. He was a husband, a father, a provider. His life had always been filled with responsibility, noise, purpose. But now, those roles were gone. And with them, a part of his identity had vanished too. What John said wasn't cruel, it was true. And sometimes, it's the truth that hurts the most. Aging alone doesn't just test your patience. It tests your will to keep going. Because it's not about silence in the house. It's about the silence within. The kind that creeps in when there's no one to talk to. No one who needs you. No one to share a meal or a moment with. That single question from a friend, so simple, so real, opened David's eyes to something he hadn't been ready to face. He'd been surviving, not living. And that realization stirred something inside him. He knew he couldn't keep walking through each day like a ghost in his own home, waiting for someone to knock or call. That's not living. That's waiting to disappear. David needed to reclaim something for himself. His time, his spirit, his right to feel alive again. He didn't need a miracle. He just needed to take the first step. The days after that conversation with John felt different, heavier in some ways, but also clearer. David couldn't shake that question. What if one day you're truly alone? He realized he'd been drifting, caught in the rhythm of a life that had grown too quiet. Wake up, sit in the same chair, watch the same shows, go to bed, repeat. There were no milestones anymore, no reasons to mark the passing of time. But he knew that had to change. So, one morning, without any grand plan, he got up, tied his walking shoes, and headed to the park. The air was crisp, the sun just peeking through the trees. It had been months since he'd gone out like this, not just to run errands, but to breathe, to move. At first, he didn't walk far. Just a slow lap around the path, watching dogs chase frisbees, toddlers stumble after ducks, couples sitting in quiet conversation. He did it again the next morning, and the next. That small walk became his ritual, and as the days passed, he started adding more to his routine. He visited the local community center. There, he found other older folks like him, some widowed, some divorced, some simply navigating the loneliness of aging. It wasn't easy at first. Conversations felt stiff. The loneliness in him resisted connection, but he kept showing up. Eventually, he joined a chess group. The game wasn't just about strategy, it was about presence. Sitting across from someone, engaging, sharing space and silence without feeling invisible. The games brought a strange comfort, a reminder that he was still sharp, still worthy of companionship. He started exchanging small talk with others, a retired mechanic named Ben, a soft-spoken former librarian named Grace, and even the staff who ran the center. Slowly, David's world began to open up again. But even with these small victories, the ache didn't vanish. Every evening, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, that question returned. What if I get sick? What if I really am alone, and no one's there to notice? It gnawed at him, not as fear, but as truth. The kind of truth you can't ignore forever. It wasn't that he needed someone to fix everything. He didn't expect his kids to drop their lives for him. But he longed for a connection deeper than casual conversation. Someone to care, not out of duty, but out of choice. This chapter in his life wasn't about recapturing the past. It was about redefining the future. He had taken steps forward, yes, but he still felt something was missing, something real, grounding, shared. And it was in that quiet space, somewhere between growth and grief, that he met her. It happened quietly, without any big moment or dramatic introduction. David was sitting in the corner of the community center library, flipping through a gardening book he had no real intention of reading, when he heard a soft laugh behind him. It wasn't loud or showy, but it had warmth, the kind that gently wraps itself around a room. He turned, and there she was. Margaret. She was a few years younger, maybe late 60s, with silver hair that framed her face just so. She wasn't flashy or overly outgoing. There was something calm about her, something settled. But her presence had a way of making the space feel less empty. Like she didn't need to fill it with noise, she just needed to be in it. Their first conversation was short. She asked if he liked the book. He admitted he didn't even know what it was about. She smiled. Me neither, she said, holding up her own copy. I just needed a reason to sit somewhere quiet. That was all it took. Over the next few weeks, David and Margaret started to bump into each other more often, at the center, in the park, even at the local farmer's market. They'd share stories over coffee, talk about their children, their pasts, their aches. It turned out she, too, had been widowed. Her children had moved away, successful, loving, but distant in the way adult children often become when life pulls them in different directions. What struck David most was how easy it was to talk to her. He didn't have to explain himself. There was no performance, no pretending to be stronger than he felt. She understood the silences between sentences, the grief that still lived in his chest, even after all these years. They never labeled it. It wasn't a romance in the traditional sense, not at first. It was something else, companionship, understanding, the peace that comes when you know someone sees you not as a burden or a shadow of who you used to be, but as you are now, fully human, still valuable. Margaret brought life back into David's world. She had a little garden behind her house, and he started helping her with it. He invited her over for dinner, nothing fancy. Soup, sometimes scrambled eggs, or reheated leftovers. But the warmth wasn't in the food. It was in the company. The clinking of 2 spoons instead of 1. The way she laughed when he spilled tea and tried to blame the uneven table. The soft hum of her voice when she read the paper aloud. Together, They made each other's homes feel like homes again. They brought light back into rooms that had been too quiet for too long. There was no need for grand declarations or future plans. Just being together was enough. And for a man who had once believed his days of connection were behind him, that feeling meant everything. But even the most beautiful chapters must turn their page. One afternoon, as they were walking back from the park, Margaret grew quiet. Her son had called. He was getting married. He wanted her to move across the country and live with him and his new wife. He had space. He had plans. He wanted her close. David listened, nodding, even as his heart dropped. He knew this moment would come. He didn't protest. He didn't ask her to stay. Instead, he smiled softly and said, "You need to be with your son. Don't worry about me." She looked at him, eyes searching, as if hoping he'd ask her not to go. But he didn't. Because love, even the quiet kind, sometimes means letting go. The day Margaret told David she was leaving was overcast, not raining, not sunny, just still. A gray kind of quiet that seemed to mirror the air between them. She sat across from him at his kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her voice was gentle but hesitant, the way someone speaks when they know the words will hurt, no matter how softly they land. "My son, he wants me to move in with him and his wife," she said, her eyes flickering toward his. "He says he's worried about me being alone. He wants me closer." David nodded slowly, trying to manage the weight pressing on his chest. He saw this coming the moment she first mentioned her son's upcoming wedding. Still, it didn't make it easier. "That's good," he said, forcing a smile. "It's where you should be. With family." He meant it, but not without pain. Letting her go felt like tearing a page out of a book mid-sentence. Their story wasn't supposed to end here, not so soon. But David had always believed that love, real love, in any form, was about putting someone else's needs above your own. He wasn't about to hold her back out of loneliness. But she didn't get up right away. She sat there, silent, looking around the room as if memorizing the details. The small cactus by the window, the worn chessboard by the fireplace, the spot where they always sat together on Sunday mornings. "I've gotten used to being here with you," she whispered. "It feels like home." David's heart cracked at the edges, but he held it together. "And you'll make a home there too," he replied. "Your son needs you now. Go, really. Don't worry about me." They didn't say much after that. Some goodbyes are too big for words. The morning she left, David drove her to the bus station. The ride was mostly quiet. They held hands in the car, neither one wanting to let go first. When the bus pulled up, she turned to him, eyes glassy. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he answered, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. And then she was gone. Just like that, the seat across from him at breakfast was empty again. The second teacup sat unused. The small, joyful noises, the laughter, the casual chatter, the sound of someone else moving through his home, had all faded. But this time, the silence didn't just creep in, it slammed into him. It was different from the quiet he'd felt after Sarah died. That had been sharp, filled with grief and disbelief. This was heavier, like the house itself had exhaled and settled into a kind of resignation. The kind of silence that reminds you you're truly alone again. At night, the ache returned. He found himself reaching for his phone, staring at old photos, replaying the same memories over and over, just to feel close to something real, to someone who had made him feel seen again. Yet, beneath the sadness, there was something else, a strange sense of gratitude. Because for a brief moment in his later years, he had known connection again. He had been reminded that even after great loss, the heart still has room to feel, to care, to open. And that mattered. Still, the loneliness was starting to take a toll again. The empty rooms felt colder. The days stretched longer. He knew he couldn't go back to how things were before Margaret. That version of solitude, where he simply endured the day, waiting for sleep, was no longer bearable. So, one evening, after sitting in silence for too long, David made another decision. He picked up the brochure he'd once tossed aside without a second thought, the one about the nearby retirement community. The place with gardens, walking paths, and group dinners. A place with people, with life. The first morning David woke up in the nursing home, everything felt foreign. The bed too firm, the sheets tucked too tight, the hallway sounds unfamiliar. He sat on the edge of the mattress, staring out the window at the garden below. People his age were already walking slowly around the flower beds, chatting with staff, sipping coffee from thermoses. It was peaceful, structured, and strange. He had wrestled with this decision for weeks. Leaving the house where he had raised his kids, where Sarah once decorated the hallway with laughter and Margaret filled the kitchen with quiet comfort, that was no small thing. But staying meant staring into the same silence day after day, a silence that had grown unbearable. He needed something to shift, to feel like he hadn't just been left behind by life. So he chose movement. He chose people. He chose change. The staff welcomed him warmly. Not overly cheerful, just kind. There was Mr. Robinson, the retired firefighter with a dry sense of humor, Louise, who ran the weekly book club and never missed a morning walk, and Thomas, who'd lost his wife the year before and still made a point to greet every new resident with a handshake and a story. At first, David mostly kept to himself. He'd show up for meals, nod politely, and retreat to his room. But something about being around others, even just hearing the murmur of conversation at breakfast, felt like medicine. It didn't fix the ache, but it softened it. Soon, he started joining group activities. Nothing too involved. A short walk through the garden trails in the morning, helping out in the greenhouse, watching movies in the common room on rainy nights. The nursing home wasn't glamorous, but it was human. And for the first time in years, David felt part of something again. He began to find rhythm. His days had shape. Mornings started with a stretch on the patio, followed by breakfast with Mr. Robinson and the usual banter about weather, politics, or what dessert they hoped to get that night. In the afternoons, he'd read or walk, sometimes just sit on a bench and watch the wind move through the trees. Evenings were quieter but no longer hollow. There were smiles exchanged in the hallway, chess games in the activity room, soft music playing through the speakers. David wasn't just existing anymore, he was engaging. And the small things, those ordinary, quiet joys, became precious. He still missed Margaret, of course. Sometimes, when laughter echoed from the dining hall, he'd close his eyes and picture her there beside him, her soft chuckle blending in with the noise. But instead of breaking him, the memory gave him comfort. It reminded him of how deeply people could impact each other, even late in life. Even when you think all the chapters are written. 6 months in, David felt lighter. Not young, not without sorrow, but no longer weighed down by the heaviness of isolation. He'd found a new kind of peace, not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from choosing to keep going anyway. He had learned, through loss and solitude, that aging doesn't mean fading away. It's just a different kind of becoming quieter, perhaps, but still filled with purpose if you're willing to reach for it. But life, as David knew too well by now, has a way of testing the ground beneath your feet just when you've begun to find it steady again. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind David had come to appreciate since settling into the nursing home. He had just finished a light lunch, enjoying the sunlight pouring in through the dining hall windows, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was Adam's, but it trembled with urgency, cutting through the quiet like a cold wind. "Dad, I've got some bad news. Mrs. Robinson, she was in a car accident. She's in the hospital." David's heart dropped. The words didn't register all at once. It was as if time slowed and sped up simultaneously. He felt the air leave his chest, his mind scrambling to hold onto something solid. Mrs. Robinson, a friend, a companion, a steady light in his new routine, was hurt. Badly. The ride to the hospital felt like a blur, the trees and buildings outside the window a smear of color. When he arrived, Adam was waiting, his expression pale and tight. Inside the emergency room, the sterile smell, the flickering overhead lights, and the silence of people waiting, it all added to the growing dread. David sat still, his hands shaking. He had known loss before, but not like this. This time, he had dared to care again. He had allowed someone into the guarded parts of his life, and now she might be taken from him without warning. When the doctor finally stepped out, his face grave, David didn't need words. The weight of that moment landed before it was even spoken. "The injuries are severe," the doctor said softly. "She may not have much time." David swallowed hard, nodding, though everything in him wanted to scream no. As they wheeled her past, her body fragile and still, he walked alongside the gurney, whispering her name. In the ICU, he sat beside her bed, holding her hand, watching the machines monitor the rhythm of a life he couldn't imagine letting go of. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and with what little strength she had left, she looked at him and said, barely audible, "Live well." And then she was gone. The machines continued their quiet hum, indifferent to the heartbreak unfolding beside them. For a long time, David didn't move. his fingers still wrapped around hers, now cool to the touch. The grief was sharp, immediate, unbearable. In those moments, it wasn't just about losing her, it was losing the chance to keep building something meaningful in his final years. The void felt cavernous. But in the days that followed, through the fog of mourning, those two words, "live well," began to echo in his heart. They weren't just a goodbye. They were a final gift. A call to keep going. Margaret's death had taught him about love, but Mrs. Robinson's passing taught him about resilience. The kind that doesn't come from denial or distraction, but from walking straight into the pain and choosing not to give up. Even when your heart feels shattered. Even when it's easier to shut down and retreat. He began showing up again, quietly, slowly. A nod in the hallway. A return smile. A hand offered during a chess match. He found healing not in forgetting the pain, but in letting it live beside the joy, side by side, both part of the same life. And that life, David realized, was still his to shape. Still his to honor. Her words became a compass. A quiet nudge forward on days when getting out of bed felt like too much. And it was through those steps, those acts of grace and quiet strength, that David discovered something far deeper than healing. He discovered purpose. In the quiet months that followed Margaret's passing, David found himself reflecting on life, not just the events that had shaped him, but the deeper truths that had waited until old age to reveal themselves. Aging, he realized, isn't just about survival. It's about reckoning with everything you've gained, everything you've lost, and everything you still have the power to become. There was no denying the loneliness. It didn't vanish overnight, but it no longer defined him. What once felt like a void began to feel like space. Space to breathe, to think, to feel, and to choose. David had spent most of his life being a provider, a husband, a father, roles that gave him purpose. But now, without those responsibilities in the foreground, he was forced to ask, who am I outside of those roles? What do I stand for when no one is watching, when no one needs me the way they used to? The answers didn't come easily. They never do. But he began to notice that as he let go of expectations, his own and others, he uncovered something more permanent, a quiet dignity. A kind of peace that comes only when you've stopped pretending and started accepting. Accepting the losses, yes, but also accepting the beauty that still exists in small, ordinary moments. He found himself lingering longer during conversations at the nursing home. He listened more and judged less. He saw pain behind other people's smiles and joy behind their silence. He became the kind of friend he wished he'd had during the darkest moments, present, steady, and never pretending to have all the answers. That, he realized, was its own kind of purpose, being a light, however dim, in someone else's tunnel. David also started volunteering within the home, helping newer residents settle in, especially those overwhelmed by the transition. It reminded him of how far he'd come, not just in location, but in mindset. He used to see the nursing home as a symbol of surrender. Now, he saw it as a chance to live intentionally, with fewer distractions, fewer illusions. There was clarity in the simplicity. He no longer measured life in milestones, but in meaning. Not in what he had, but in how deeply he could connect, with others, with himself, and with the present moment. Some afternoons, David would sit by the window, the same spot Margaret used to love. He'd sip tea and watch the wind stir the garden leaves. That view, once a backdrop to loneliness, had become a place of reflection. "Live well," she had whispered. And he was doing his best to honor that. Not by chasing grand gestures or trying to reclaim youth, but by making peace with the present, by understanding that contentment doesn't come from fixing the past or fearing the future, but from finding stillness in the now. He also began to accept that some people will never fully understand the journey of growing old until they walk it themselves. And that's okay. It's not his job to convince them of anything. His job now is to live in a way that feels true, to lead by quiet example. Aging had taught him the value of humility, of letting go, of softening the grip on things he once held too tightly, status, pride, even regret. By this stage, he no longer feared solitude. He respected it. Solitude, he had learned, was not the same as being alone. It was a space where healing could happen, where clarity could surface, where the soul could breathe. And in that space, David wasn't just surviving, he was evolving. The final realization wasn't dramatic. It came gently, like the soft closing of a door. He didn't need to be remembered as the man who had it all figured out. He just wanted to be remembered as someone who kept showing up, for himself, and for others, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. That, he believed, was the truest kind of legacy. If David's story resonated with you, take a breath and sit with that for a moment. Maybe you saw yourself in his quiet mornings, in the ache of an empty house, or in the quiet strength it took to start again after losing everything that once made life feel full. Or maybe you're not there yet, but you sense it coming. You're preparing for it, wondering what life might look like when the kids are grown, the routines have changed, and the world around you has slowed down just enough to hear the silence. But that silence doesn't have to be empty. It can be a space you fill with intention, with the kind of living that has nothing to prove and everything to feel. This story isn't just about aging. It's about reclaiming authorship of your later years. David didn't plan to lose his wife. He didn't expect his children to drift or for companionship to become so rare and so precious. None of us do. But what he did, what you can do, is choose how to meet that reality. With bitterness or with grace. With retreat or with quiet resilience. The most powerful thing this journey teaches us is that there is still time. Time to open up. Time to connect. Time to forgive others and yourself. Whether you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s, or beyond, you are not finished. You are still becoming, still evolving. So here's a moment of honesty. You don't need to do everything at once. You don't need to solve loneliness in a day or turn grief into peace overnight. But you can take one small step, one change. Start a morning walk. Say yes to a conversation. Call someone you've been missing. Or simply sit outside and breathe in the day without rushing through it. It's the slow, gentle habits that rebuild a life worth living. And maybe, just maybe, you've realized something else too. That aging with dignity isn't about staying strong all the time. It's about allowing yourself to be real, to be vulnerable, to say, I miss them, or I need help, or I'm scared to be alone, without shame. That kind of honesty is where healing begins. Now, if you're still here with me, I want to ask you to take part in something small but meaningful. If this video moved you, even just one moment of it, please give it a like. It helps more people find these stories, people who might be sitting in that same kind of silence David once faced. People who need to know they're not the only ones feeling forgotten, or unsure, or overwhelmed. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I share stories like this often, real, honest, human experiences that matter, especially for those navigating the later stages of life. This isn't just a channel, it's a place for reflection, encouragement, and truth. Drop a 3 in the comments if you stayed with David until the end. It lets me know you were here, really here, and that you felt something. And if you're comfortable, share one takeaway. What part of David's journey reminded you of your own? What will you do differently tomorrow? Not in a grand way, but in a human way. Here's one idea to get you started. Based on everything we've explored, create a connection plan. Nothing complicated, just a list of 3 people you'd like to reconnect with, or 3 community spaces you could explore, whether that's a local senior center, a church group, a volunteer circle, or even an online forum. Keep it visible. Put it on your fridge. And once a week, act on just one. Through all of David's journey, through the grief, the solitude, the unexpected friendships, the tragic goodbyes, one truth emerged. The quality of our final years is shaped by how much courage we have to keep opening our hearts. Even after loss. Even after disappointment. Even after we've convinced ourselves it's too late. It's not too late. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for honoring this story. And thank you for being part of this growing community of people who are choosing to live with more purpose, even in the quietest chapters of life. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of your heart. It's carried you this far for a reason.